Welcome to ADEC in Conversation, special series addressing COVID-19. I'm your series moderator, Dr. Jill Harrington, coming to you from our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Joining the conversation is Mr. Isaiah Allen, Executive Director of ADEC, who is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And today we welcome Dr. Robert Neimeyer, founder and director of the Portland Institute for Loss and Change, or Portland Institute for Loss and Transition, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Memphis. Dr. Neimeyer will be talking to us today about COVID-19, grief, loss of the assumptive world, and meaning making. And I just want to say that Dr. Neimeyer is probably the most preeminent scholar in bereavement, grief, and loss, as well as clinician. And I want to thank him for being with us here today on behalf of ADEC. So Dr. Neimeyer, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you for your characteristically generous introduction, and of course your hyperbole in introducing me. It's always good to have our shaky self-esteem buttressed by others, but in any case, it's good to talk to you about such a meaningful thing in such difficult times.
You know, Bob, people are reporting they're observing so many emotions right now: anxiety, fear, distress, frustration, anger. And we know that grief is a normal and a natural reaction to loss. Mm-hmm. Do you think people are grieving?
Oh, most clearly we are grieving, aren't we? And we are grieving losses both obvious and subtle, named and unnamed, even to ourselves. I think one of the recognitions that would be really important to take on is knowing that not only do we stand to lose loved ones, and of course we live with the dire forecast of 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 or more among us here in the United States will die. And indeed, the estimates could go far larger than that. So literal bereavement under very complicating circumstances that we'll no doubt talk about is a big part of the picture. But the loss of a conventional reality, the loss of our assumptive world, as you say, all of these things also impinge on us. Many of us have lost much of our financial security. Some of us have lost our jobs, even in mundane ways that are nonetheless very consequential. We may lose our childcare, or our own sense of our invulnerability may be challenged by the prospect of this disease coming into our home, into our bodies. So the losses are numerous, and it is a kind of rolling thunder that will continue to play out, not just a storm that will pass through quickly through our lives and our society.
So sounds like a giant tsunami of grief.
It's a good way to phrase it. At the same time, I don't want to lump everything under the heading of grief. I want to acknowledge that we have, of course, the capacity to show a whole range of emotional reactions, as you point out. And such things as anxiety or threat or even depression can be importantly distinguished from grief. Other problematic reactions of a defensive kind, as when a person emphasizes his or her personal invulnerability, as often young people do, by going out and socializing regardless of the restrictions. This is also a problematic kind of reaction. So I want to acknowledge that there are lots of functional ways to respond to this global threat, but there are also many dysfunctional ways. Anxiety, for example, I think has to do with confronting a world that is not one that we are prepared to deal with. It exceeds our capacity to make sense of it, to have a ready and adequate response. Much about this condition calls up a keen sense of anxiety. And we are now collaborating with an investigator named Sherman Lee. And the we here is Jane Millman and myself, to understand what we are calling and now measuring as coronavirus anxiety. And we developed a brief screener instrument for that. I think that's importantly different than grief. It's kind of the first wave of response, and then the grief begins to flood in the aftermath of that anxiety. So we can talk about this in a multidimensional way, not reducing everything to grief, but recognizing that loss plays a part in all of it.
So, I mean, you've done a lot of work, and I appreciate your humility on, you know, your scholar and everything you've done in the grief and bereavement world. But you've done a lot of work on sudden loss and sudden illness, and COVID-19. This kind of came on really suddenly, and that loss of the assumptive world. Like, maybe you can just talk a little bit about that, about, you know, some things we've learned from sudden loss and loss of the assumptive world.
Well, you know, with COVID-19, more than any condition in certainly in our living history, you'd almost have to go back to the Spanish flu epidemic of the First World War or the European Black Death or something in the 14th century to find a comparable circumstance. You have a perfect convergence of a so-called natural death scenario. People die of the flu all the time, right? A natural death scenario intersecting with many of the features of a violent death scenario. And the suddenness, as you point out, is certainly one such. None of us imagined, you know, during the holidays of December, that this would be what the new year would deliver, and with such terrible insistence and global impact. So there is a quality of suddenness to the erosion or even explosion of the life we thought we were living, when we find ourselves in a strange new world that keeps getting defined and redefined week by week, with implications for our behavior, who we can be with and when and how, and to what extent. This is something that is requiring incredible adaptations of our assumptive world. And rarely do we have to undergo such consistent and profound and deep-going revisions of the world of meaning that we count on to get through breakfast. So when we talk about the assumptive world, of course, we salute here the good work of Ronnie Janoff-Bullman in really introducing this, along with people like Colin Murray Parks and John Bowlby, who also spoke about the assumptive world in the context of bereavement. What we mean is that taken for granted matrix of assumptions, right, that we just count on as implicit knowing that in some way life is relatively predictable, that we have a modicum of control over what happens to us, that we can protect those we love, at least in some measure, from grave harm. And that somehow the world is benevolent, that events make sense, that we can wrap a story around our experience and somehow put it into some perspective. All of these factors and more, including assumptions about justice, and for many people, even a kind of divine justice or a sense that the world is a safe and good place, all of these can be revealed to be very fragile human constructions, very fragile illusions. As we reckon with the fact that in the face of this invisible threat, we are soft bodies in a hard world, and we are all experiencing a collective vulnerability to it. That means we got to rewrite a lot of the ways we think, a lot of the ways we act, and a lot of the ways we feel going forward.
So our assumptive world is kind of, you know, our time in history is very different than sort of the pre-industrial world, as well as medieval times or times of the Black Plague or typhoid, scarlet fever. And now this is not really part of our assumptive world at all. It hasn't been. And but I also don't want to make that assumption either, because it hasn't been something globally, but there have been other countries that have dealt with sort of outbreaks of diseases like Ebola and SARS, but this is the first one that's a sort of a worldwide contagion and kind of different from the outbreak of typhoid. You know, life was going on while typhoid was happening, and, you know, views of life and death and safety in the world were a lot different at that time. People, you know, didn't really, death was a part of life sometimes in medieval times or pioneer times, you know, and I think some of that anxiety is also maybe created by our assumptions about life and death as well too in these times now. I'm just wondering, sort of as people, some of our death anxieties are coming up as well too. But we also know because of media and social media that they didn't know typhoid was happening all over the world when it was happening. We know now it's a global pandemic, and that's also creating a lot of fear for people too.
Yeah, I think that there are 100 things in what you say that really could make webinars in themselves. It's a really a rich set of associations that you offer us. One is the transhistorical, and this is not where most listeners will be fascinated, but I think it's worth underscoring that within other cultural or historical frames, these plagues made a kind of sense. Now, they may not make a sense that translates into a contemporary Western conceptualization. For example, they might have been understood as a kind of, a divine retribution for human immorality, for example. And most people today would not, resort to such framings of this pandemic, though some will. But at least that provided a story. At least it made sense. At least it was not this impersonal threat. Of course, now we still are trying to formulate a narrative or a story to wrap around this. And we use a lot of metaphors around it. So it becomes a war, right? And we have generals in the war. We literally are talking about calling out the troops. We're still looking for, and we're also hearing other language that is troubling but understandable, like the military concept of acceptable losses to accomplish a mission. What will be the acceptable losses, the number of lives or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives we're willing to trade to get the economy going again? So in some ways, we are prisoners of our metaphors, metaphorically speaking. And these larger narratives at the level of the culture and at the level of the administrations of different world governments will also partly govern our response, and the way we frame it, the meaning we make of it. So when I speak of meaning making, I really want it to be elastic enough that we're looking not only at the personal ways in which this may challenge or change the meanings by which we live, but also those kind of larger cultural frames that exercise a real influence on us, whether or not we choose that or not. And we're undergoing transformations of meaning at many levels, from the practical, daily, meaningful routines that structure our days on through to, government policies and our spirituality, and certainly everything relational and psychological in between.
So, with that said, I mean, it really depends on how people are experiencing this is really dependent on their assumptive world.
That's right. And if we're invested strongly in a sense of control, then this will powerfully challenge or even shatter that assumption when we realize how little we can protect even our children, or our parents from this contagion. If we're powerfully invested in a sense of divine justice, then we will maybe suffer a kind of secondary loss in having to reappraise that belief when we see that good people can experience bad outcomes in this contagion. So who we are will shape what we lose and how we grieve in the aftermath of that.
I honestly have to say, I had a client who's an introvert, and she said to me, "This is my time to shine. I have not really, honestly, the only loss maybe is a little bit of a sense of security, this fear of maybe getting COVID, but I'm doing just fine. I'm loving the time alone. I'm loving being in my books." So, what do you think of that? What do you think of people how we're all going to process this differently?
Well, I think we are, and that's both for better and for worse. Human variety makes it hard to promulgate one-size-fits-all solutions at a time that we also need to have those universal kind of guidelines. But it also guarantees that almost any given assault on our worlds of meaning, on our ways of being, will be accommodated more adequately by some than others. And we need those resources of resilience somewhere in the culture to be able to bounce back. But let me give you a darker view of this, right? And I say this fully agreeing with my buddy George Bonanno that in the aftermath of traumatic experiences of all kinds, bereavement included, there's plenty of good empirical evidence that most people are resilient. However, and rather than falling into complicated grief or the kinds of things we might also talk about, however, all of those studies are conducted in the context of individuals, small groups, a family, suffering a loss or a trauma, in the context of enduring and resilient systems of a broader kind. People still have a workplace to go to take their mind off their personal loss, or they have an intact set of friends they can come together with for tending and befriending, right? Or they have an intact spiritual belief system, or like me, they have a Zendo that they can go to and meditate a couple times a week. None of that is available now in the form it once was, nor is it likely to be for many people, as the foundations of all human structures get powerfully shaken by this. And as many governments around the world will experience repercussions, they will likely fail. We will have social structures failing at many levels of our organization. And there just won't be enough trillions of dollars, even in the American Treasury, to prevent the collateral damage that will arise, even beyond the literal illness and death of people. So in the face of that, I think we have to recognize that resilience, while we will certainly work toward that and we will observe it in many, may be less resounding than we might imagine. To be more specific, I've been thinking about clients who I see, right? And they have different orientations to life, to attachment, they have different resources. But I would predict that this is the sort of thing that will make people more what they are. So if people have very secure attachment styles, they're going to bounce back, they're going to reconnect with people on the other side of this in whatever forms they safely can. But I think that people who have a sketchier sense of security in relationships, insecure attachment styles, marked, for example, by avoidance or anxious dependency. And I think it's going to be a rougher go for them. If you're not too sure that relationships are safe to begin with, and you're marinated in this month after month, I can easily imagine a lot of people being a little more evasive when they walk down the street, or more likely to hole up in their home rather than to press themselves out into the social world. On the other hand, I can imagine people who have a kind of, in some ways, the opposite defensive response, where they may push themselves into affiliation in really dangerous circumstances and contribute to a second wave of contagion. So I think our diversity as people and very basic ways of coping, making sense of things, attaching, will probably be exaggerated. We're going to see both forms of response in stronger form. And those of us who are doing psychology or thanatology are going to be, and other helping professions are going to have plentiful caseloads as people are bringing personal vulnerabilities that have been exaggerated by this catastrophe into our offices, probably for years to come.
And you bring up a really interesting point because, history would tell us that we're able to be resilient through epidemics and pandemics. That's if we go back on historical data. But history has never seen it in this time. So the things that make us human beings in this time is different than what maybe made us human beings 100 plus years ago.
It's true, but if you look at least in the modern, not the postmodern world, but let's say the world of the last 200 years, we have always had at least the capacity for pockets of a given society to provide disaster assistance to others, or one country can do a lend-lease program that supports another, or reconstruction efforts like the Marshall Plan. But here, every country is being devastated by this. And so there is a great tendency to turn inward, seal the borders, and that may be a necessary thing, but it means that there are fewer resources outside the systems that are struggling to support them than we might otherwise have. The same thing applies at the individual level. Usually, right, if someone is going through a hard time, our family and friends can wrap around and give support and so on. Here, there's a real limit to how much we can do that. I recently was talking with a friend about I guess this was someone who was talking to me. This is Carolyn NG, the associate director of the Portland Institute in Singapore. And she was talking about how now all of us, not only at the end of life, but all of us are connected to life through machines, right? And we're all in isolation in some way. We may be with a small cluster of family members, but many of us, like myself, are not. And so our connection is through wires and screens, and that's a far cry from a human hug. So I do think that we have remarkable resources. The technologies available are often life-saving. But I think that the consequences of this for how we move forward after the pandemic, we'll be sorting that out for years to come.
Sure. So, I mean, with that said, I mean, there's no doubt that there's going to be lots of feelings of loss, whether they're actual losses or losses to identity, losses to income, losses to sense of security. I mean, I've listened to a lot of what you talked about in the dual process model. So when people adapt to loss, right? I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that, about what the dual process model is and how you think this may apply.
Well, of course, this is the model proposed by our friends Maggie or Margaret Schrobe and Henk Schut in the Netherlands. And, Maggie would say it's not the dual process model, Bob, it's the dual process model. And she'll correct it, and I'll say, you're right, Maggie. It is a little jewel of a model. It is a gem. And the two facets that it reveals are that in the context of our everyday experience as people struggling with loss, struggling with grief, we alternate between two different orientations. The loss orientation on the one hand, in which we deal with intrusions of grief, waves of grief. We work on transforming the relationship with who or what we have loved and lost, often developing and strengthening, but also working with complications in our continuing bond, for example, to the deceased in the context of bereavement. We look for others who can tend and befriend us. We may, in that more introverted mode of your friend, pull into a place where we're doing individual journaling. If we're spiritually inclined, we might pray or meditate. But these are relatively private or local arrangements where we seek consolation in a few trusted people, in some practices, in ourselves, as we contend with the difficulties of very emotional circumstances in our loss. On the other hand, we oscillate at other times to a restoration orientation where we try to restore a world that works. We oscillate from loss to life, and we face challenges in that as well as we re-enter a world that is changed by our loss, changed by the absence of a loved one in the context of bereavement. Re-entry into that world helps us distract ourselves from and in some way emotionally regulate our grief. It lets us explore new roles, new identities, new relationships. And it's the oscillation or going back and forth between these two positions that allows us, very much like if we're walking, we put one foot before the other, we shift our weight going forward. So too, we walk through our grief by transferring emphasis or weight to one of these or the other. You can get stuck in either of the modes in an extreme way. But we find that people typically grieve adaptively by giving some time and attention to each, choosing a time to grieve, looking for people or places with whom we can feel secure with that, and at other times allowing themselves to close the drawer on grief and to be able to reorient to life, to discover or rediscover what still has beauty and meaning for us. So that's a simple rendition of that model.
Do you think though, like in the dual process model, that since we're living through multiple losses as they're kind of happening and we don't have this sense of being able to kind of reorient and be in the reconstruction part, that we're kind of like living many dual processes as we're going through this?
Well, you're sneaky. You set me up to give a simple description, but now you've really complicated it, and usefully so, because I think that is exactly right. When we are confronted with a whole cornucopia of losses, it's important that we name them and claim them, that we recognize that there are a lot of things here I'm grieving. I'm grieving my liberty. I'm grieving the security of having a retirement plan. I don't have any pension. What I had was in the stock market. That's largely gone. I'm grieving relationships that have fallen away during this time. I may be grieving my employment. I may be, grieving a sense of safety or security in my own home. Maybe I have someone in my family who is sick with COVID-19, and the other four of us are just waiting our turn now. The grief has so many facets, and I think it could present us with a kind of cloud of grief that is very hazy, threatening, unmanageable. And a first step would be, I think, to recognize, maybe just to fill out a list. What have I lost? What have I lost? What am I losing? What do I fear losing? Because the solutions, if they exist, to each of those may be different and require different actions on our part.
So getting back to resilience, we're going to kind of maybe end on that. I know you said there's going to be a challenge, you think. You painted, as you said, in your own terms, sort of a darker picture. But, what would you say to someone who's kind of going through this, or the world even, this whole tsunami of grief? What can you hold on to? I mean, if you hold on to the darkness, it's going to be a long, hard, depressing path.
I think this depends on our own strategies for dealing with things, doesn't it? I mean, some people are very practical, others more philosophic, some are secular, some are spiritual, some seek consolation and solace and understanding in dialogue, others in personal reflection or prayer. The resources people will bring to bear on this challenge of meaning will be quite variegated. And I'm not prescriptive in that. My tendency would be to ask questions about, how are you handling this? What do you find yourself doing to try to make it okay enough to get through things? Or when do you feel like, most maybe hopeful or happy? And how's that working for you? So I'm interested in recruiting and in some way reinforcing people's native competencies and strengths, take a strength-based approach. I'm not dark and dire in my outlook about this, but I also believe that it's important not to be Pollyanna, a kind of unwarranted optimistic stance, to take that as our basic view. I think we have to acknowledge the darkness as we work toward the light. And there are as many ways of doing that as there are ways of being human.
Dr. Judy Beck often talks about, the it's not very good to be Pollyanna. The CBT approach is more to try to be realistically positive if you can. And that's what I kind of hear from you is the more realistic positivity, trying to lean on some of that, but also the acknowledgement of the pain and the losses that people are enduring right now.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think that we join with others well, even in a virtual environment, when we are able to stand into their darkness with non-anxious presence, and then in that earn the opportunity to walk with them toward the light, rather than by just simply trying to give them a pep talk or using the opportunity of being with another to simply pour out our story. I think we need to listen more deeply to people in this, hear what's really at issue for them, and then, resolutely work together to address that. The world is still beautiful. I take usually 2 or 3 walks or runs each day. And, here in Portland, it's a beautiful spring. The trees are ablaze with colors and flower. The daffodils are pushing up through the soil. The squirrels are still, playing in the lawn. The birds are still nesting in the trees. We need to remind ourselves that outside the human world that is under such assault, the world still exists. And in some ironic ways, it exists in a more healthy way for our activity being so shut down. As we see the climate, for example, begin to recover visibly, measurably in a period of weeks, when it's no longer being assaulted by so much production and so much driving. So it is important for us to place our current suffering in a larger context, to seek ways that we can be empowered and be useful to one another, to address and reduce that suffering. And in that, I think we are not helpless. We do have choice as to, as Viktor Frankl once said, that, we may not be able to choose what suffering we have, but we do have the opportunity to choose the attitude we take toward our suffering. And I think that is an irreducible human constant.
And I think that's, you've worked with people who have had devastating losses, absolutely devastating losses in their lives. And I think that's so well said about, how people also approach their losses as well, too.
Yeah, I think that through this, as I find with my clients, many of whom experience profound post-traumatic growth, we can winnow this experience in a way that allows us to discover deeper wells of meaning in our life. We can reduce life to its simple, basic structures, and in this be maybe less enamored with the distractions of a capitalistic world, and one oriented around material gain and entertainment, and relate to some deeper movements in our humanity. I think this is indeed something already stirring, even in the streets of New York, as tens of thousands of volunteers, turn out to help deliver food to the elderly, for example. There are chances for a lot of benevolence, a lot of altruism, a lot of post-traumatic growth in this, but it will be paid for with a very high price of loss of life, security, and of life as we knew it.
Such a devastating natural disaster around the world, global natural disaster. Mm-hmm. Before we wrap up today, Isaiah, did you have any questions you wanted to ask Dr. Neimeyer?
Yeah, I was thinking through as you're speaking, and thinking about so many of our ADEC members whose primary responsibility at this point is providing some sort of care. And as you speak about the non-anxious presence and bringing that, most of our members have training around this and
Sure.
have experience with it. and you touched on a couple of them. What would be those, because we need these reminders in this moment, right? Because as you talk about the dual modes, the grief mode leans against the life mode, and the life mode is supposed to present some sort of stability. It's in this moment, it is not.
Well, that's,
so how do you, what encouragement or reminder would you put to our ADEC members in this moment of saying, all right, here's where you can bring that non-anxious presence as you're providing care and support?
You know, I think it can be done in many ways, can't it, Isaiah? That, you know, with your background in chaplaincy, as a seminarian and someone who attends to a spiritual dimension, you're well aware that we can develop that sense of genuine presence, meaning that we are able to be with another in whatever he or she brings forward, however hard or however joyful, in a way that is resonant, vulnerable, authentic, that we receive where they are, we start where they are, not where we are. So we don't come in with a big case conceptualization. We allow them to tell us what's at play here for them. So I think that there are some very core skills in our helping roles, whether we are in the chaplaincy, whether we're social workers, psychologists, counselors, the whole range of healthcare professions. It all begins with listening deeply to what people are telling us and listening with our eyes to what they're telling us in their nonverbal signs as well as the verbal track. I think it also starts with stillness, that we meet people well when we ourselves are at rest. And like, for example, in the therapy session I had about 2 hours ago, both the client and I were coming from a context that was very busy. Of course, she's still in that context because she's meeting me from geographic distance, and in her context of work, she herself is actually a therapist. And I just said, I wonder, this isn't her actual name, but I wonder, Karen, if we could just begin by taking a few minutes here, a few moments, to arrive in the room together. I wonder if you'd be willing just to kind of close your eyes with me for a moment. And just to give yourself the luxury of a few deep breaths, breathing with your abdomen, not just with your chest. And just allowing ourselves to release some of the anxiety, some of the tension, some of the demands of these difficult days, as we just kind of center on the question, you know, what has importance for me now? What do I need to bring here? And we just do it like that. Maybe it's, you know, it's a 2-minute intervention, and then we open our eyes and say, so what rises up? And the conversation that ensues is just more grounded. It's more real. It's not, well, let's see what happened this week. Let's see, I was just talking. You know, the person's up here. You sort of want to invite them down here to speak from a deep register of their being. So I think that in some ways that have to do more with our being than with our doing, we cultivate presence in the client by displaying it in ourselves and inviting it in the relationship. It's a partial response to what you're saying. Of course, things like the practice of mindfulness or meditation or contemplative traditions, getting comfortable with silence ourselves can help us even when we open our mouths and start to talk.
In closing, I want to kind of address the thanatologists in the room. You know, the study of thanatology, coming from thanatos, which is Greek, and ology, which is the study of, only has been around for maybe, I think, 60 to maybe 90 years at best. And at the time, you know, it arose because of this whole idea of a death-denying society. That, you know, cemeteries used to be in the center of town because life and death kind of coexisted together. There was never a guarantee for humanity that, you know, life was never guaranteed. It was very hard. Life and death were very much in parallel. And so from a thanatology standpoint, you know, we've been studying this, and the study of living in a death denying, you know, society where technology has allowed us to live longer and have more expectations and kind of suppress the idea of death. What kind of impact do you think this is going to have?
Well, it shatters the illusion that we are invulnerable to death. It shatters the illusion that death is something that can be tracked outside us, predicted. This is invisible and insidious, and it is universal. And so I think, again, it is that kind of undermining of an assumptive world that seemed justified, at least in an advanced Western context where death could be segregated and, you know, placed in hospitals or palliative care settings or hospices. Now it's, you know, in the pandemic, those kind of comfortable boundaries where we can kind of put it out of sight and out of mind simply are eradicated. And it's the only story on the news. Week after week after week, it's sort of impossible to step out of this dominant narrative. So I think that there is a strong call to reorganize our consciousness about these things and to recognize the place of death in human life, even as we strive to mitigate it and limit its impact. What we haven't spoken of that I had thought we also might, and time may not permit it, but just to signal in the briefest possible terms, you know, the World Health Organization has now adopted a diagnosis in the International Classification of Disease, a prolonged grief disorder. Holly Preggerson and many others have advanced this for a long time. However we feel about that, we recognize, I think, most of us, that there are ways that grief can get really complicated and stay complicated and intense and disabling for a long time. It's part of why we do the work we do. And the risk factors for this kind of complex, complicating, intense, disabling grief are increasingly well known. And they include things like, you know, social isolation, a sense of not being able to make sense of what's transpiring. We know that conditions of care, for example, at the end of life, when that we are helped to accommodate the death, we're helped in our bereavement, when we can be alongside our loved ones, when we can hold their hands, when we can give them a kiss, when we can sleep overnight in that uncomfortable vinyl chair alongside them, when we can have the conversations that promote forgiveness and affirmation of value. All of that is denied us now. As my neighbor is finding, her husband had a major cardiac event and she took him to the hospital. She had to leave him there. She couldn't go in because of the COVID crisis. His condition has nothing to do with COVID-19, but it resulted in a quadruple bypass from which he might or might not survive. And he has been laying in hospital now in intensive care for a week, and she can't even see him. That's the kind of context that when and if a death follows this, much less in the context of a COVID-19 death, we're left with a lot of unfinished business. Our sense of powerlessness in the face of that kind of dying, the sense that we have failed in our most basic attachment obligations to tend someone in the time of their greatest need. These are the kinds of circumstances that are associated with much more complicated courses of bereavement. And they will be the normative course for every death that happens from March 1, 2020 in the United States on through to who knows when. Because the only alternatives are whether people are going to die in isolation of that kind, maybe with some flickers of contact, you know, on a cell phone. If a harried and busy nurse is able to hold the phone to their face for a couple minutes a day, that's the best of the outcomes, because the all of the deaths by any kind of illness will take place under that circumstance, or they will be violent death losses to traffic accidents, suicide, and homicide. And the latter two categories will certainly be going up. As we know, the gun sales are escalating, people's despair and sense of entrapment and hopelessness is rising exponentially. So it's almost as if we have now entered an era where the risk factors for complicated grief are present in essentially every case. We can't even bury our dead. We can't even go to their funerals except virtually, as we sit kind of shocked and disempowered looking at them unfold on our laptop with few chances to participate unless we get creative. That would be another kind of program to have.
We had a little bit of that on our panel last night. And Bob, I want to also add, there are people dying at home who didn't necessarily, they and their families want to go through a home death.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I was listening to the chief of gerontology at Oregon Health Sciences University. This was about 10 days ago. And she's a really wise, compassionate clinician, researcher, administrator. And she said, well, here's what I tell my patients. She's in gerontology, right? So she said, you know, if I'm working with an older patient and they have significant symptoms of COVID-19, then I say, please don't come to the hospital. Please accept the medication that we can give you to help you be more comfortable, and instead focus on dying at home, because the context of the hospital will be a horrible death for you. And even if we find a respirator to put you on, you will be on it for 10 to 20 days. And if you survive that, lying in isolation for that period of time, your systems, your bodily systems, will not have the resilience to come back. And you will be significantly impaired from that point forward. So please consider staying at home and dying. Now, you know, this is the world we've now entered. And the reality of it is going to be, it's going to play out in hard ways going forward. So as much as I believe in post-traumatic growth and resilience, I think we have to acknowledge that we've got some real challenges ahead of us as a thanatology community in attending to these issues.
That's just so sad, because the reality is that not everybody has the resources to die at home. Having been through it with both of my parents, one who died in a hospice setting in a hospital and one who died at home, you know, it takes a lot of resources. And if you're a person who lives alone or you don't have family, but these are the choices people are being confronted with right now.
And, you know, again, if we look at that in-home hospice care model, this is not designed to deal with contagion that is highly virulent within those same homes. In hospice, in only very rare instances do you have to worry about everybody else in the family contracting the same illness that is taking the loved one. So this fundamentally challenges basic social structures, including structures of hospice and palliative care. It's hard for every medical and mental health specialty, but we have a major role we can play, including as thanatologists and counselors and therapists more generally, in offering support to the frontline medical personnel who are experiencing enormous stresses in this and who greatly need the compassionate listening and work that we might do alongside them. So
true. I mean, just watching some of the nurses crying on TV, saying that they felt so bad for their patients, they had to hold up an iPhone while their loved ones said goodbye, and the pain and the suffering they're really going through with these families and all the grief they're taking on.
That's right. Yep, and they become intimate participants perforce in all of these family deaths at the time they might otherwise discreetly step out of the room and decompress.
Dr. Neimeyer, I want to thank you so much for being with us here today. I know all the way out from Portland, Oregon, you know, this is affecting the entire world, and, you know, the work you do, you're out there helping people and taking time out of your busy day to kind of be with us with our special series here addressing COVID-19 and ADEC in conversation. So I just want to thank you again, and for being with us, for lending us your thoughts, your expertise.
Thank you, Jill. I feel like I might have come across as Dr. Doom here, and that's not my intent. I actually am a pretty happy and resilient guy myself, and I do believe that we'll get through this, most of us, in some fashion. We might even be deepened and made wiser and more compassionate by the experience.
It's really important, all the things you laid out for. We all see them. If anybody's worked with complicated grief, we see all these risk factors out there, and we're going to be having a conversation with Dr. Kathy Shear from the Center for Complicated Grief in New York on COVID-19 and complicated grief. So hopefully you all, I want to just tell you, everybody, please tune in for all of our ADECs in conversation. Isaiah, thank you so much for joining us again here today. And to everyone who's listening, be well, be safe. And if you're not an essential worker, we hope you're practicing and following safe social distance